1 year ago, I started work on my game, Deli Island. Deli Island is an isometric cooking and shop management game that I've been developing in Unity, where the player will run their own deli and forage, grow and cook all the food they sell in the shop. In the game, you'll be able to befriend NPCs, upgrade your shop, and slowly build up the island to make it flourish again. And this is my progress so far. What you're seeing on screen was my first attempt at making the game. I made a little character, got him to move around, pick up an axe and chop a tree. This little prototype took me absolute ages to develop, was very badly programmed, and in short, was a steaming pile of I eventually abandoned the project when I tried to take on the behemoth that was the inventory, and completely failed. So I decided to take some time to learn as much about Unity and pixel art as possible, and take another stab at the game when I was better prepared. Over the next couple of months, I studied and created a few simple projects in Unity, whilst also practicing my pixel art skills on the side. I already had a basic understanding of programming from my time at university, but I still needed a bit of time to practice with Unity before feeling comfortable enough to take on my main project. Then, at the beginning of 2021, I created this mock-up for the sort of game that I wanted to make. It wasn't perfect, but I really liked the feeling it evoked, and the idea of creating an isometric pixel art game really intrigued me. So after practicing with Unity for a couple of months, and with a clear artistic goal in mind, I set out to make the game for real this time. I started out with the basics, an empty Unity project, and a whole lot of motivation. So I started by adding a grass floor, some rock walls, some ground vegetation for variety, randomly placed trees, randomly placed rocks, and obviously, the player. I got the player to look around with a mouse, gave him some basic movement, and made him pick up objects. Yeah, I totally did this all on my own without any help from a certain tutorial channel. Yeah, no way. God, I miss him so much. Anyway, I decided around this time to take on my old enemy, the inventory. But this time, I had the power of God and brackies on my side. The biggest problem for me to wrap my head around was Unity's UI system, which wasn't particularly beginner friendly. But with a bit of perseverance and a whole host of bugs that I won't go into great detail about, I managed to get a functional inventory working. It does everything you'd expect of an inventory. You can move items around, break the stack in half, drop one of an item and so on. It wasn't perfect by any means, but it was a start. So now that I had my new shiny inventory, I could finally add some fun stuff to the game, like an axe. I started by getting rid of the ugly placeholder axe that I had before, and made a new one in A-Sprite. I then added the sprite to the game and created a scriptable object for the axe to give it some functionality. So as you can see, even though there's no player animation yet, I can click on the trees with the axe selected and it falls. I also made the trees drop wood now, that the player can pick up and add to their inventory. Before I added more tools to the game, I wanted to change how the trees and rocks get spawned in. Before, I just randomly placed them manually all over the place, and obviously that method wasn't going to cut it. So I wanted to find a way to better control the amount of objects that get spawned in, and where they get spawned. I did this by making a simple spawn manager script, that at the start of the game loops through all the tiles in the scene and randomly chooses what object to spawn, if any, depending on their spawn percentage. So now I can easily change their spawn percentage to choose how many of each object I want spawned. Let's take a look at what this looks like in game. It might not be obvious at the moment, but you can more or less see that the objects spawn on a grid, and line up diagonally with each other. Once I show you the HOTA, it will be easier to see. But as you can see, every time I restart the game, the trees and rocks spawn in at different random positions, adding a bit of variety to the game. Moving back to the tools, the next tools I added were the pickaxe, the shovel, and the hoe. They all do what you imagine they would. The pickaxe breaks rocks, the shovel removes tree stumps for now, but you'll see later on that I give it an extra functionality, and the hoe hoes the ground. As you can see, the hoe allows us to see the grid more clearly. All the hoe really does is just place a rule tile on a tile map above the grass. If you don't know what a rule tile is, it's just a tile that updates itself depending on the tiles that surround it. So if a tile is only surrounded by 2 other tiles, it looks different compared to being surrounded by 3 tiles or 4 until a maximum of 8. Adding the rule tiles was more of a pain than I anticipated, because you have to create 47 different tiles for each rule tile, so it can be quite time consuming. After implementing the tools, I was getting quite bored of looking at the same trees the whole time, so I decided to spruce things up a bit and made 2 new tree varieties, the pine tree and the sakura tree. I also updated the original oak tree model. I'm not completely convinced by these new trees, and they'll probably need to be updated again at some point down the line, but for the moment, they'll do the trick. I also decided to add a little bit of juice to the game, by making items do a little bounce when being dropped, and moving toward the player when being picked up. Now that we can hoe the ground, I thought the next best thing to implement would be the plant growth system. But to start the growth system, I would also need time, as in an actual in-game clock to know when the plants needed to grow. So I created a simple singleton script that kept count of the days, minutes and seconds that the game goes through. Whilst I was doing this, I got a bit sidetracked and decided to quickly add a day-night cycle to the game. So I installed Unity's 2D Lights package and got to work. So to not waste time, I sped up what you're seeing on screen right now. But essentially, what's happening is that when the in-game clock hits 8 PM, the sun starts going down, the sky becomes a reddish colour and the luminosity starts decreasing. And the opposite happens when it hits 6 AM. The luminosity increases, the colour goes back to normal, and so on. With the time system and a day-night cycle implemented, I could finally add the first seeds to the game. A peanut seed and a wheat seed. The seeds are scriptable objects with different variables on them that we can change in the inspector, like the actual plant game object, the time it takes for the seeds to grow, the growth states that the seed will go through, and the final crop that the plant will drop. This is what the plant growth system looks like in game. Ignore the updated player sprite, we'll get to that in a minute. So when I change the days in the time script, the plants update themselves and change their sprite. In this case, plants grow at different speeds, so you can see the wheat grows quicker than the peanut. I really like how this looks and I feel it brings a lot of life to the game already. It was around this time that I wanted to change the grass. I didn't like that the grass was like one big green carpet below everything, so I decided to add a dirt layer below the grass to break up the monotony a little. I really like the way this turns out, but it meant I had to do a mini overhaul on the hoe and shovel tools. I made it so that the player would be able to hoe the dirt ground instead of the grass itself, but this meant I needed a way to remove and place grass so the player had enough space to grow their crops. This is where the shovel comes back into play. The shovel can now be used to remove the grass then gets added to the inventory and the player can place it wherever they want, adding a little layer of customizability to the game. After this, I thought it would be a good idea to implement one of the bigger features of the game, the shop. I started by drawing the house in A-Sprite and adding it to Unity. This looks quite nice, but it's just a glorified rock at this point, so let's give it some functionality. First, I created a simple scene that would be the inside of the shop, and all I needed to do now was connect both scenes. Connecting scenes in Unity is fairly simple and straightforward, so now when you click on the door, it will take you to the next scene, and vice versa. There is a small problem though. When you leave the overworld scene and come back, any changes that you previously made are gone. That's because we haven't implemented a save system yet. So every time we leave a scene and load the next one, we're loading the default data that the scene has when first starting the game. There are plenty of ways to save things in Unity, but I decided to just save all relevant information in JSON files. So when we load a scene for the first time, it will load with the default scene data. The player can then make all the changes they want to the scene and leave. When the player leaves the scene, the game then gets the data I want to save, such as object positions, the inventory data, changes I made to the ground and so on, and saves it to different JSON files. And when we load the scene back up again, the game no longer loads the default data, it will load the information directly from the save file. So as you can see, we can break a tree and it falls down. Leave the scene, come back, and the tree remains broken. Perfect. After taking on such a big overhaul of the save system, I decided to update some of the game's visuals as a way to take a bit of a rest from the programming side of things. First, I updated the player idle and movement animations to better fit the isometric style. The ones from before weren't really cutting it for me anymore. I think the animations look a lot better now, although they'll still need some work done to them in the future. The inventory assets were also updated to look a bit better as well. I then added a clock and a calendar in the top left hand corner to better show the time, date and weather to the player. And lastly, I added water tiles to the ground for a bit more visual variety, and also for functionality, so that the player would be able to collect water with a bucket. I then realised I didn't have a bucket and decided to make one. After taking that little programming break, it was time to add the next big feature, a crafting table, or more aptly called, a cooking table. I wanted to make a table where the player could take their ingredients and mix and match them to make different food items. So I created a table that opens up a book UI with different tabs. So far we have the Combiner tab, the Mortar and Pestle tab, and a Knife tab, but that one doesn't do anything yet. In the Mortar and Pestle tab, the player will be able to grind down base ingredients into different new ones. So for example, we can take the wheat and grind it down into flour. Then in the Combiner, we can mix the bucket of water with the flour, in any order that we like, and we get dough. In the future I want to make the UI interactions a bit more juicy and interactive, but for now all I wanted to implement was the base systems from which I can work from. To round out the cooking gameplay loop, I added the oven to the game. My initial goal with the cooking system was to completely make one simple food item, and work my way up from there. The oven works the same way as the Mortar and Pestle does. It takes in an item and returns a different one. Now we can add the dough to it and we get bread. Nice. I was really happy with how the game was going, but there was one thing that kept nagging me, and that was how the player interacted with the world. I kept encountering all types of problems, like the player not colliding correctly with certain objects and clicking on the wrong tile all the time. So I decided the best thing to do was add a selector that the player could move around with the mouse. The selector would only be active when we have a tool, a seed, or a placeable object in hand, and only has a range of one tile, so you can't interact with objects that are really far away. The selector makes it really clear what tile and object we're interacting with and just feels a lot better than the system I had before. The last couple of things I recently added to the game were a sickle to pick up crops, a transition when entering the house, and an FPS counter to check for any random dips in performance. And I think that's everything. A whole year worth of work summed up in one video. It isn't as much progression as I would have wanted, but there were some months where I wasn't able to work on the game. If anyone has any questions about some of the systems in the game, feel free to leave a comment. I might even make a more in-depth video on how some of them work if there's enough interest. But that's about it for this video. If you enjoyed it, please remember to like and subscribe so as to not miss the next one. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye for now.